Welcome to the Tackling College Sports Podcast, the definitive resource to help you navigate your way to play college-level sports. Here are your hosts, Chris Legates and Mark Franco, where they want you, the TCS Nation, to be your best.
Welcome, TCS Nation, and thanks for tuning in to the Tackling College Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Franco, and alongside me is my co-host. Yeah, you're used to him dropping knowledge, but now he's dropping pounds, Chris Legates. Today, Chris and I speak with Dr. John Cohn, who is the founder and CEO of Fit for 90. John has experience both playing and coaching at the college and professional level. John also has extensive experience as a sports scientist, coach, and educator, which gives him the unique ability to bridge the worlds of science and sport. Let's dive right in and see what Fit for 90 is all about. John, welcome to the luxury suite that is known as the Tackling College Sports Podcast. We appreciate you taking the time out this morning and joining us.
I look forward to it.
John, could you tell us how you got into the position you are in currently? And please feel free to start from early on. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the meandering path. Like so many of us, it's kind of a circuitous route. But essentially, I was obviously a college athlete. A short stint, very short stint as a professional athlete in soccer, obviously, and kind of entered the domain of sports science because of that. I ended up not being able to continue playing at a pretty young age through injury and kind of moved quickly from, a liberal arts focus in my education to much more of a science focus. I was pretty fortunate, to have a decent amount of coaching experience, coming relatively early, the summer camps and whatnot, leading straight into coaching college and, fortunate to have an education pathway through the universities I worked for that allowed me to kind of do the things I needed to do in terms of my own education in sports science, get a master's degree along the way, and then just kind of, made my way up through the coaching ranks, if you will, from coaching at the youth level, Division II level, and working my way up to work at a number of different Division I teams, both on the men's and the women's side, and then ultimately becoming an assistant coach in the MLS after I left Carolina. And then, really, what I found myself in the role there was I kind of wore two hats, at least two hats, but my primary, focal points were on training the goalkeepers and also managing the team's fitness. And so I was 05, 06, and I kind of got to the point where I started to recognize that you couldn't do both jobs well. I think that was the first thing. The other thing was I really was much more passionate about the sports science and the goalkeeping. I found it more engaging and so forth. So decided to leave my position there and do a PhD at that point in time. So having already done a master's degree in exercise physiology, I kind of went to the other side of the spectrum in terms of, more on the applied neuromechanics side or biomechanics side, if you will, and focusing much more on the movement side of sports science. And then, coming out of that, my PhD, where I studied basically, soccer-specific fatigue and how it affects biomechanics, returned but to the MLS and was director of sports science with the Portland Timbers. And then since then, and even kind of coincident with then, I've been have had my own company called Fit for 90, and that's really what I'm spend most of my time doing now is working as a consultant with a fairly large number of college pro teams, youth teams, as well as developing software-based technologies that are helping us better monitor our players. And so that's a big part of what I do now. And then obviously I work as a coach educator for U.S. Soccer.
Yeah, John, it was great to speak with you over the summer when we at Southern Connecticut were exploring using the Fit for 90 program. Going backwards just to your beginning of it, what was the light bulb moment that made you come up with Fit for 90? And can you describe a little bit about what Fit for 90 is?
Yeah, so I mean, I think kind of the premise of Fit for 90 really, I think this is probably true of a lot of software kind of based companies, currently is it kind of came out of a consultancy that I was doing previously. So I really started delivering periodization consulting to college coaches back in about 2005, actually when I was in Kansas City. And did that for a large number of years. And at that point in time, everything I was delivering was paper based, and we could only manage so many teams. And so, what happened over time is this grew into essentially Fit for 90, which is more of a software driven approach, where we were now delivering periodization consulting to a much larger number of teams, because obviously, two things going on. One is the software made it much easier to deliver to a larger number of teams, because it made it less time consuming for me to develop the information and periodize the information and so forth. And then in turn, it allowed us to actually deliver more detail to the coaches than we did previously, kind of through the paper-based approach. And so that was really kind of the starting point for Fit for 90, where we really iterated, I think, to do something different. Really came out of us developing the monitoring system. So the subjective monitoring system that we deliver, that, for instance, is currently used by the women's national team and about 300 other teams from the college level, the professional level, teams abroad using it currently, and so forth. Where that's really the part that's grown most recently, and I think is obviously, probably the more scalable from a business standpoint is the monitoring piece, because obviously it delivers a lot of really good information that helps the coach do a better job in terms of understanding the readiness of the players and so forth. So that's really kind of been the pathway of Fit for 90, and really where it all began is obviously with the us identifying the need for the coaches to be able to have this information and have it more readily available and have it more easily digestible. And so, for instance, the monitoring piece is something that I was doing. I've been doing for a number of years. I was doing it in Portland in a paper-based method with the Timbers. And really, if you have ever had the proverbial aha moment, was when me and my two interns are rifling through the guys' papers and trying to see if anybody really has an issue on the day, so to speak. And we look around the room at each other and like, well, who set up the warm up? And one of them bombs outside to set up the warm up with about 7 minutes before training starts. Yeah. And it just became, you realize, well, this is untenable. And so if we're struggling with it and nobody's really solved it, it was obviously a need. And then obviously from a periodization standpoint, having this information, what it really allows us to do, is when you have the team-based periodization and really the systematic approach being delivered and developed. When you now take this information at the individual level, it's very easy to adapt your training environment to treat the individual within the team. And that was really what we're after, was getting information that would allow us to modify training in a way that was really intelligent and really would allow us to circumvent a potential injury, maximize each individual player's performance on the weekend. And so that was really the objective of the whole thing. And that's really what we're continuing down this path. And we have a number of things that we have a laundry list of things we want to do, but then we have a number of things that we are doing and currently developing out. And it's all geared towards this, but better management of the players.
Yeah, and I could tell you from experience, as I mentioned before, we use it now at Southern Connecticut State with our women's soccer program. It's a fantastic program. We've been able to now look at the data every day that the athletes input, and sometimes there is a need to tweak your training sessions based upon the information that has been provided by them.
Yeah, I think the college environment in particular, there's a lot of things that we aren't aware of, where you can't have enough conversations with the players. The demands of the student athlete are there, and not always something we're able to fully understand. And I think that's one of the things that we've seen at the college level that the system really is able to do is enable more conversations and really to understand when there is an issue that would require modification.
And you speak of this laundry list of goals that you may have for the future. What would you say are some of those, and what is the ultimate goal of Fit for 90, John?
Yeah, I mean, if you looked at the overarching goal, like I alluded to before, is to deliver, better health and well-being to the players. And obviously a big piece of this is through education of the coaches. So for instance, we've recently launched a coaching education pathway. So that's one element that we're working towards, is building out more content, more information for the coaches, so they can better understand the sports science side of the game, and not so much in reference to the science, but in reference to the practical application that's grounded in our training environments. The big piece that we're really working on right now that I think is going to be really impactful is we're working on an individual application. So, currently, obviously, what we deliver is a team-based monitoring system, and there's a need for the individual athlete to have a way to not just track themselves and then in turn share that information with their coaches, but then also to get something back, to get information back from the system that would ultimately optimize their own performance through essentially an injury and recovery application. So essentially, the goal of the system is you're familiar with the system is obviously we're tracking the readiness of the players. They can report, specific sites of muscle soreness or tightness that may affect their movement on an individual day or over time. And so ultimately, with that information, what we're doing is developing an individual exercise prescription program that would allow the player to get information that's very specific to them, that would essentially help them better prepare for their training sessions if they have a movement issue on the day, over the long term start to address movement dysfunctions that ultimately would maybe change the way they move in a negative way, of course, that would lead to an injury, and get them back to a way where they're moving more fluidly and more efficiently, if you will. And so that's been a big emphasis of ours, and we're currently building out that application now, and that's probably the most exciting thing we're working on currently. The other elements of course, are building out, rebuilding our team-based periodization, and that's kind of taken a backseat to this individual application, because ultimately we want to deliver something to each individual player. And I think this one has a lot of impact, I think, because ultimately, currently the way we do it, the team is buying in, and if we can get down to the individual player. I think the example I always use is the 15, 16-year-old, kid that's playing multiple sports, that's playing, field hockey, lacrosse and soccer. They can now invite their other coaches to also see their information. So we can simultaneously, solve a lot of problems of the multi-sport athlete, as well as the sport-specific athlete that maybe starts to develop overuse patterns at a higher rate because they're always playing a single sport. And so there's a lot of use cases that are simultaneously going to be addressed through essentially a more comprehensive approach to this, if you will.
Well, that's interesting, because that's something we've discussed on this podcast many times, John, about gearing something for the multi-sport athlete, and now with more sport-specific training that there is. This sounds like it's a home run if I'm a kid who's 14, 15, 16, and this is the group that we're targeting with these podcasts, who are potential college athletes. Wow, it sounds like such a home run.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing to be working on. And no question, we have two different problems. We have two different problems if we just look at those two scenarios. Obviously the multi-sport athlete, there's always a question: are we doing too much? And there has to be communication essentially between the player and the coaches, and then ultimately the parent. So me as a soccer coach, if that player's already gone and had basketball practice and then they come to my practice, I need to know about that. Yeah. And that's something that we would be able to deliver through the system. Like I said, the player that's always playing one sport, now they're starting to develop these movement deficiencies or dysfunctions because they're overtraining maybe a little bit in that sport. And now we can modify to get them back to a normal movement pattern that maybe, alleviates the potential of an ACL injury and so forth. So there's a lot of impact, I think, and it's really interesting because it's It just has I think it has a lot of value to it when you get down to the individual, and you can treat each individual player the way they need to be treated.
Absolutely. It sounds great. John, in the team-based program, as far as that's concerned, what other sports right now is Fit for 90 applied for?
Really, almost every sport. So we have football using it, ice hockey, field hockey, lacrosse, volleyball, basketball. We really have a foothold. We have a foothold in every sport. So we have every team using it. And really, the only thing that I would say soccer specific about it is really our name. Right. Other than that, it really is, the monitoring is just sports science.
Do you find that any one sport more than the other, maybe even more intricate with the details that they may want, that the coaching staffs may want?
I think there's subtle differences, and some of it comes down to, really the difference when we look at different sports is how we end up displaying the data, obviously through the filtering of positions. There are certain things that coaches have come to us and wanted to be added to the system, and kind of what we walk this line on is kind of we ultimately there's a breaking point in terms of we ask the players to fill out a questionnaire that's too long or start to fill out too much data. The compliance is gonna drop off because it just becomes too big of an ask, if you will.
Right.
And so there is a prioritization of specific items relative to the information that we need as coaches to help us do a better job. And so that's one thing we're always considering is what do we really need from the players that's going to enable us. So, for instance, the hydration piece was one that we added in, last year. So the players are basically just self-reporting the color of their urine through a simple chart. If you've ever been in a college locker room, the charts above the urinals and toilets are everywhere. And so basically, that's one thing we add in because that's obviously a high value piece. It's relatively easy for us to get from the players. But there are other ones that come in. I'm working on doing the research on one specific item now and trying to decide if it's something that we add in or not. And I think it has, there's two pieces that I think are really valuable that we'll probably be adding in the next year or so to the team system. But it is kind of this process of deciding what's really meaningful. And a lot of times some of the coaches come to us and they ask us to put in pretty extensive questionnaires, and we know full well that the players would fill them out for a week and then the compliance would really drop off. And so we're kind of you end up being the gatekeeper a little bit of your software, because obviously we aren't an open platform, because ultimately we're trying to help the coach understand the data through the way we display it. For instance, the color coding system you see when you look at the system.
Right.
Wow, John, if I could just interrupt for a second. I'm just thinking as you were explaining the process and the fit for 90, it just seems to me that, and perhaps you're working on this, but a wearable type of situation just seems like a natural fit, whether it be a Fitbit type, a Garmin, or even Apple's watch.
Currently, they do not play in. I absolutely see it as a potential for the future. For us, we've talked to companies in the past about integrating and so forth. But currently, it's not something that we integrate with. But certainly, through the consulting, I work a lot with the teams that we have, using heart rate, using GPS, how to look at that data, what we should be looking at when, and so forth. So it's definitely in our plan. The question is just how do we go about it, and when do we go about it, and so forth. But we've already been working on the methodology pretty extensively.
John, what have been the toughest challenges in your career? And please touch upon any potential issues that you might have run into with getting Fit for 90 off the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's starting a startup business. It's unbelievable how I think proverbial startup phase, we're just going to be there forever. It just goes on and on. And so Fit for 90, I think the biggest thing is just staying committed over a relatively long window of time and doing it for relatively bootstrap method. I think that's probably been one of our biggest challenges from a company standpoint, is just being patient with the growth of the product in terms of sales and finances and so forth. I think, you have to have a lot of passion going into anything like this. And for sure, that's really what drives us. My business partner is a former player that played at UNC, so somebody I know really well, and that for sure helps. They have a background in the game as an athlete. And so both of us are really passionate about what we're doing every day. And I think that's a big driver that helps eliminate a lot of the challenges. Obviously I'm not I'm the sports science guy. I don't have a strong business background, and so having somebody from a business, the business side's really, really been important. And so that's helped, with the challenges, that I have as an entrepreneur, if you will, So those have been from the standpoint of what I'm doing now. Those have kind of been the challenges. I think, the challenges, is from a career perspective. I don't really look back and the things that have been, been challenges in terms of my career pathway, they end up being actually educational experiences, I think, more than they ended up being challenges in the end, if that makes sense. More of opportunities, I guess, in hindsight.
So our podcast is geared toward that student athlete that is looking to make the next step and continue their athletic career in college. You've been involved at some of the top athletic institutions in the country. What are some of the top tips about the recruiting process that you would give the student athlete that wants to play collegially?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been on. I think it's safe to say I've been on every side of the fence with this one. From being a youth coach to the college coach to the even working in PDL and seeing the transition from PDL back to college and college to PDL and back again. So every different environment. I think that's one of my strengths are these experiences, and the conversations I would have with a youth player when they would be going through the recruiting process was ultimately trying to find not just the best fit from a soccer perspective. And I've been really fortunate to deal with a lot of high level athletes, a lot of good players, that had a lot of promise at, not just in the college environment, but well beyond. And even that player that I was very confident in being able to make it as a professional player ultimately, I would give them the same advice, as a player that I didn't think would be able to succeed at the professional level, and that was to find the best fit environment that you possibly can, and not just from a soccer standpoint. I would actually emphasize very heavily the academic environment and the school environment, and say, you never know what's going to happen, to any of them, because ultimately you have to pick a school that you're going to come out of with a great education, happy with your experience. And, if you were to get hurt in the first week of preseason and not be able to play again, would you stay there? Because ultimately that's the biggest thing. I think we're all coming out of this, with something that's valuable, and the biggest value is a college education and a great experience as a student athlete. And so that's the biggest thing I tell them is you pick a school where you'd be happy without the game. Whatever the game is, whether it's soccer, field, whatever, pick something that if you didn't have that game anymore, you'd still love being there.
John, if you were a recruit looking at a program, now knowing that it's not just soccer-based, but whatever sport you're looking at, and the coaching staff told you that they used a Fit for 90 program, what would you as a recruit think about that program? What would you think about their commitment to the student athlete?
Yeah, I think it speaks, and this is something I talk about regularly with the coaches that we work with, and then also even on a first conversation with a coach about the system, is that really I would say our approach is very athlete centered, and I think that's one of the biggest strengths of it. I think about the athletes I've worked with, and I always tell people, in my experience, no one cares more about the athlete than themselves, and an athlete that really wants to perform and wants to stay on the field and so forth. They're really going to take care of themselves, and this application is designed to better engage and more effectively, engage the players in this process, and then also allow the conversations to happen with the coach. So for me, it does show a high level of commitment of the coach to the athlete health and well-being. And that's a big piece. I think for me, if I'm looking at the environment that I'm sending my kid into, I think that's has to be a big concern and one of the priorities. Are they gonna be looked after effectively? And nothing's more important than keeping them healthy. And that's really a big piece of what we're trying to do.
And kind of piggybacking on that, and you did touch upon it a little bit in an answer before, John, with so much sport-specific training and kids playing one sport, but even the kid that is a multi-sport athlete, we have this, and it becomes the hot topic sometimes. I run a club program in Connecticut. It has about 240 kids, so that means there's 480 parents involved as well. How important, in your expert opinion, is rest for the student athlete? How many breaks a year should an athlete take, John, and how long do you think those breaks should be?
Yes, that's actually really, it seems a simple question, but it's extremely complex. And it's basically, what makes it complex is you have to consider the density of the schedule. So not just the duration of time they're involved in the season. So not just the duration of the season, but essentially how many games they play in that length of time, right? And so obviously, I think college soccer is a great example. Where it's a relatively large number of games in a very short period of time. And so with that, if I'm getting the lion's share of those games, the lion's share of those minutes, the chance of me overreaching, overtraining is much higher versus a player that's maybe not getting as frequent, games. They're like fewer minutes. I have to manage them differently, and so they in turn can have a very different experience in the breaks and so forth. At our youth level, when we talk about now, for instance, if we were to compare, a traditional season where we have maybe 3 months in the spring, and then we have a month off in the summer window, and then we have another 4 months in the fall, a month and a half off in the winter or whatever it is. It all comes down to the number of games they're playing in a given period of time. So it's almost an impossible question to answer because it's so specific to that environment. The number of games they're playing in a given point of time is really the core element of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely does. And to kind of follow up on that question, both you and I, our backgrounds in soccer, and you work with U.S. soccer, but I would think this would apply to AAU basketball, junior softball, whatever the sport is, John. Are there just too many meaningless games?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think ultimately you have to look at, when I teach, periodization, and we talk about a week, we always talk about the games kind of being the bookends, the start of the week and then the end of the week. And the same would apply for any sport, and so how many games become too many is really depending on the recovery from one game to the next. And so when we do start to talk about what's a meaningful game versus what's meaningless and so forth, as soon as you start to have a larger number of games where the players aren't able to in effect recover to actually perform well in those games, for me now that we're playing too many games, because now if the players are going in fatigued, we're starting to see overreaching, we're starting to see overtraining potentially. We're starting to put the players at risk. That's a clear problem. The other part that we never talk about, is if we play too many games, the developing player, a 13 or 14-year-old and so forth, if they're tired going into those games, they're not going to learn effectively. And so the game's a great learning environment. So now they're going to underdevelop. So as much as we focus on, kind of the other elements, it layers into absolutely every element of what we want to do with our players when we talk about youth, youth players, adolescent players, and so forth. We have to start to think about what's the optimum number of games relative to their ability to recover. And then also our ability as coaches to have time to teach and develop them within the week, between the games.
I would think, John, as well, some of the data points to that we have from the physical standpoint, but obviously from the psychological standpoint, too many games and it becomes a chore and the player now doesn't become as excited about, okay, I have to get in the car, go with mom and dad. If you're playing one of those 5-game tournament weekends, I'm sure by game 3 or 4, you're mentally exhausted as well as physically exhausted.
Yeah, I mean, you really can't separate the two, can you? I mean, they're the bodies. You have to look at the body as a whole, and the physical and the mental go hand in hand. I mean, it's just impossible to parse the two apart. And you're absolutely correct.
And just quick aside, I always have this. I'm a big proponent of this. We know that the U.S. Academy system has, I think, mandated either 3 or 4 trainings for every one match, and I think that's a great idea. But on the horizon, and hopefully it passes with NCAA Division I men, we've talked about the split season on this podcast before. I would have to think from your standpoint that'd be something you'd be very much in favor of as well.
Yeah, I think it changes now the college environment to be in an environment that actually leads to player development.
Right.
And that's. Everybody points, from a soccer perspective, everybody points a lot to the European models in terms of the development academies, professional development academies and so forth that lead to the pro players and so forth. And I think there's a lot of strengths actually to the college environment we have in the United States. I think the split season would certainly enhance its current form. It would certainly make it much, much better. But ultimately, one of the things that it offers is a different pathway for a player to become a high performing, a professional player, because ultimately only so many kids are going to be ready for the pro environment at 18, 19 versus maybe a late maturing player goes on to college and spends 4 years in the college environment developing. Now they're more than capable of becoming a professional player. And so I love the fact that our environment and the structure of our soccer environment allows two different pathways to become a professional player. And I think that's one of the strengths. So hopefully, the split season would for sure improve that environment even more.
And obviously, from a student athlete welfare standpoint, John, you'd be looking at situations where maybe a player plays a match on Saturday, has ample time to recover, maybe Sunday, Monday, and then developmentally, like you said, but also training wise, now you pick back up on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and obviously gives more training time, but also even for those nagging injuries that a season will let you have. A player now may not miss as many games if they have an ankle sprain or something of that nature, correct?
Oh yeah, I mean, the density of the season again is the challenge in the college environment, and the fact that you get a little niggle, now you've missed half the season. It really is. It's too bad. It's sad for the player that has a small injury that now leads them to miss the majority of their college season. It's really too bad.
Do you, from what you've heard, do you think that'll be something that will pass with the NCAA ADs?
I mean, it's tough to speculate, not being on the inside environment and so forth, to talk about it. But I obviously have a lot of conversations with coaches about it. Mm-hmm. I think just knowing the NCAA environment, I think it's always going to be a long shot given the role of soccer as a non-revenue generating sport.
Right.
But I think hopefully at some point they start to recognize that the number of injuries that are occurring in the college environment due to the density of the season can be fixed relatively simply. And ultimately you hope that the awareness of the health and well-being and putting that as a priority would drive this forward, and make that a decision that the NCAA makes, because I do think that that's something that we know is occurring.
Well, you've answered the easy question so far, John. I'm going to turn it over to Mark now for the getting to know you portion. I will tell you this. Many guests have folded under this line of questioning before.
All right, let's turn the lights down low here and put the spotlight on, John. Here we go. Question number 1. If we were to search your phone, what would be the top 3 played songs?
So I'm a big fan of Pandora. So I mean, I'm kind of at Pandora's whim at points in time. But the dinner time. So my wife coaches, so most of the time I'm in charge of dinner, and so my dinner time music is typically a go-to of Mark Knopfler or the Cowboy Junkies. So pretty calm.
Okay.
And then the antithesis, when I have a nice little setup for my gym in the basement, is the absolute opposite, which I either go to Social Distortion.
Sure.
Or Rancid.
Oh, wow.
Pretty similar. So yeah, the opposite ends of the spectrum. So
that's a big difference between Mark Knopfler and then Rancid.
Oh yeah. I'm all over the map when it comes to music.
Awesome.
All right, let's stick with your phone. Who is the most famous or infamous person you have in your contact list?
I have no idea. This is a tough one. Famous wise,
told you it's not going to be easy, John.
No, it's not easy. I mean, I'm thinking, famous. I'll throw out Tony DeChico is probably one of the more famous people on my phone. Yeah, let's stick with that.
Do you have a favorite quote or quotes?
Yeah, so I was actually talking to a friend of mine the other day, and we were talking about quotes, and the one that sticks with me that I probably use the most is just the concept of just learning vicariously. I use that one all the time. So not just if you pay attention to others and learn from their mistakes, and so forth. I think a common phrase would be about people living vicariously. I'm not a big fan of that, but I certainly think learning vicariously is hugely advantageous. I'd much rather learn from somebody else's mistakes than my own.
Like that.
John, can you give the listeners a little known fact about yourself?
Little known fact. Try to come up with something exciting. There's just not much to it, Yes, he's getting hot. No, I mean, I think No clue. Grew up in Golden, Colorado, which people probably know, but I had a father who was an avid skier, so that's probably the biggest one. Is I love to ski more than anything. Nobody really knows that because they only know the soccer side of me.
Right.
Who has been your biggest influence?
It's looking at my past. I think it kind of comes around, and as much as when you're a kid, you hate the idea that you're going to grow up to be your father. I think for sure, my dad's probably been the biggest influence on me. He was an entrepreneur, had a geochemical lab, and in hindsight, I'm following in a lot of his footsteps in terms of starting my own business, but then also the reasons why I started my own business. I can point to him and a lot of the same reasons why he started his business.
And the last and final question, what web-based sites or tools can you not live without for either work or personal use?
Well, I already gave you the Pandora. So that's can't go there. I mean, the ones that you spend a ton of time on, obviously with our business, Slack is a big one to communicate with the developers and so forth. That's probably the one I spend the most time on. I need to be more on top of my Twitter account. I definitely not big on social media, but that was one that's almost in the New Year's resolution coming up.
Excellent. Well done. Let's throw it back to Chris.
He did it. Get him a towel. Got to get him a towel. Yeah, got to get him a towel. Well, get back to the final question from me, John. What would be the best piece of advice that you have for parents of student athletes? I mean, you've done it as a coach, as a recruiter, as a trainer. What would be the advice that you would give to a parent?
I think the biggest thing is, when you look at your kid, and obviously this is going to be different, it'd be subtly different advice for the college student athlete than it is the youth and adolescent student athlete. I think we have to think, in terms of the experience that the players are getting, regardless, this is the one that I'm trying to think of something that really spans, from the youth to the college athlete. And really, you have to think about what sport has to offer beyond its competitiveness and the social situations that we're putting the players in, the leadership situations that they're now a part of, how it actually builds that person. I think is really, really important beyond the competition, beyond us looking at it as a purely athletic endeavor. There's a huge amount to be learned through sport. And I don't think we always value that as much as we should. And that would be the biggest thing is as you look at that team environment that the athlete's in, you're really, are they maximizing it? Is it something that's socially positive? Is it something that's improving them, not just as athletes, but much, much more importantly as a person?
That's brilliant. Mark.
Okay. And how can listeners get in touch with you?
Yeah, our website is fitfor90.com. So just FITFOR90.com. My email is jcone, JCONE at fitfor90. And then Twitter is at JRCone, JRCONE.
Great. We'll make sure we put all that information up on the show notes so the listeners can access that information.
Perfect.
Do you have anything else you wish to promote today, John?
No, not really that I can think of. I mean, obviously, with us launching this individual product coming up soon and building towards that, ask the listeners to please get in touch if they have interest in that and get on the list in terms of, we'll be looking for beta testers in the not too distant future. So if that's something that interests the listener, please get in touch with us via the website or just email me directly.
Yeah, John. Once that happens, we'll put it up as well.
That'd be great.
Help promote that. And I just want to personally take a second to thank you. I sent you an email and, we conversed a little bit, but our college helped have a great season. We turned it around from an okay season last year. And I really, really do think that Fit for 90 was a big component to it. It's a program I would recommend to any coaching staff. And if once the individual platform comes out, knowing how you guys do it, I would absolutely recommend it to any potential, student athlete who, whether again 3-sport or specified athlete. I just think it's phenomenal. I really do.
John, thanks again for joining us. We really appreciate you taking your time out and explaining what Fit for 90 is all about.
Thanks a ton.
Great. Thank you. And remember, TCS Nation, if you want to contact us, it's on the web at tcsnation.com. Make sure you sign up with your first name and email to be included in the Friday 5. Yeah, that's the F5, a weekly email of 5 items we are interested in or pondering. If you'd like to email us, it's chris@tcsnation.com or mark@tcsnation.com. On Facebook at facebook.com/tackling college sports. Twitter is @TCS Nation, and you guessed it, on Instagram, TCS Nation. Until next time, be your best.
Be your best.
Your college sports future awaits. So join the TCS Nation and be your best.